Hello my friends, welcome to another Scientific video. In this one we're going to look at what the homeostasis is again, following on from the previous video on the nervous system. We're then also going to look at the endocrine system as an overview, what the glands are and how they work. We'll then look at the blood glucose and how that is regulated in the body, including the role of insulin and glucagon, as well as then what diabetes is in type 1 and type 2. Let's go! So we're recapping homeostasis here from the last session that we had, and in that we discussed how it's the regulation of the internal conditions of a cell or an organism, and it's about trying to maintain the optimum conditions for reactions to happen and for our body to function, and that is pretty much because of enzyme action, trying to help them to function as fast and as best and as easily as they can so that they can form smaller products or larger products or whatever it is they're trying to be making. So enzymes control pretty much every single reaction in the body. We talked about at the time how there are different things that they focus on in homeostasis that we have to manage. We're going to be looking at this one of blood glucose concentrations today, but in future session we're going to also cover body temperature and water levels, how to manage nitrogen concentrations in the body, all sorts, obviously the ones that we need to know about for the course. But all of these still, even though it's not just the nervous system we're focusing on anymore, we still have receptors which send information to a coordination center. Receptors, remember, receive information from a stimulus, which is a change in the environment. That information is sent along a nerve to a coordination center. That coordination center, like the brain or the spinal cord, will decide what to do. And for the endocrine system, that's all automatic. So it's autonomic. It's not something that you need to think about. You can't think, oh, I need to release some insulin, and your pancreas starts working. It's all regulated automatically. And the coordination center will coordinate that by sending a nervous message to an effector. An effector, remember, they can be either a muscle or a gland. That's the only two things that an effector can be. So muscles will cause movement by contracting, or a gland will secrete hormones, which is what we're focusing on today. So we're looking at this job of the hormones and the job of the glands and what they do and how they control our body in certain ways. Hormones are chemical messengers, so that's why we release them. They're released into the bloodstream and they pass these messages around our body, and they are really just chemicals. You've probably heard of dopamine, serotonin. They are chemicals that send messages. But hormones work in a similar kind of way. They pass through our blood, they travel from one organ, which is a gland, to another organ to have a response. So for example, this one at the top of, well, in the center of your brain, is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is what we call the master gland. That's the one that has a lot of jobs. And it, for example, will release ADH, which is a hormone that controls blood water levels, and so that hormone is released into the bloodstream where it's carried to its target organ, which is the kidney, and it produces an effect, which in this case is to either release more or less water. And so the pituitary gland here, its job is to release, well, it acts as a master gland, but it releases a number of different hormones, some of which act directly on a target organ, and some of them actually will trigger other processes in the body related to hormones to work. So, for example, it might coordinate how the ovaries release sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. So these glands are releasing these chemical messages called hormones, and they can cause action in the body. But these are chemical messages, so they're not instantaneous. They have to travel in the blood to a location. They can, obviously, they don't choose which blood vessel they travel through, so they're going to travel around the body. So they need to work in a specific way. And the specific way that they work is kind of like how antibodies work, in the fact that they have a specific shape which binds to a receptor shape on the outside of a cell. So they have a specific shape, a bit like an enzyme actually in lock and key theory. Their chemical has a particular shape which will trigger a particular organ to start working in a particular way. But because they are chemicals, they're going to last in the blood for a long time compared to what is a nervous message, which is almost instantaneous, so fast. So they do linger and last for longer. Nervous system actions are much more quick and faster to travel, but also last for a shorter period of time. So hormones travel more slowly, but last for longer. So let's look at what these different glands are in the body and what their job is. So the first one here we've got is the pituitary gland. As we said, that's the master gland. It's right in the core of the head, really, at the base of the brain, right next to the place called the hypothalamus, which is like the coordination center almost of the body. So it's regulating so many different systems in being in this core of your head. But that's what we need to know. It's a master gland. The next one down is this one, which is situated at the base of your neck. It's called the thyroid, which you might have heard of, like thyroid problems. And this links to metabolism. You're going to explore this more in the future. We've then also got this one down here. It looks a bit like a leaf. This is the pancreas. And the pancreas has a few roles, but it releases digestive enzymes. And it also releases insulin and glucagon, so it is involved in regulating blood glucose. The next two here are found on top of the kidneys, which is the renal system, and so therefore they are the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands release adrenaline. I don't really need to write that bit out. Then we have the ovaries. And finally, the testes. And these, of course, both produce sex hormones. We're going to explore each of these more in time. Each of these have their own system, which we're going to explore, depending on whether you do biology as a separate science or combined science. But each of these have a very important role. So the pituitary gland is the master gland. The thyroid is involved in metabolism. The pancreas is digestive enzymes and blood glucose. The adrenal gland produces adrenaline. The ovaries produce female sex hormones, being progesterone and estrogen, which is what we'll focus on more in the reproduction section. And the testes produce testosterone. But again, all of these are triggered by receptors picking up a change in the environment. A coordination center like the brain or spinal cord will cause a message to be passed to these to act as effectors. Simple. So let's look at our first system, the regulation of blood glucose and how it works. So blood glucose is all regulated by the pancreas. The pancreas monitors and controls glucose concentration, so it will detect the glucose concentration of the blood, because obviously we're looking at blood glucose here. And it will act to bring the glucose concentration back to what we call a normal level. If it goes too high, it will do something, and if it goes too low, it will do something. Now bear in mind here, if you're doing foundation only, you only need to know what happens if the glucose concentration goes too high. But if you're doing higher, you need to know what happens if it goes too low. But both of these act in something called negative feedback, where negative is doing the opposite of something. So if you're adding 1, you're going to take away 1. That's doing the negative of the add. If we've lost something, we're going to do the negative of that, which is to add it. It's doing the reverse. So negative feedback is about reversing a change. So that's what we're trying to do here. So we are reversing a change. And a lot of homeostasis is negative feedback. If your temperature goes too high, we try to reverse that. That's negative feedback. So if the glucose level goes too high, our body responds by the pancreas producing and secreting a hormone called insulin. That there is a hormone, and that's really important that we know that. Now, insulin has 2 jobs. It will travel in the blood to target cells or target organs, mostly the liver. That's a lot of its job is in the liver, but it will travel to a lot of other organs like muscles too. And it will cause glucose to be taken in from the blood into cells. If we have too much glucose in our blood, it really plays with osmosis, and it can be really damaging to our blood pressure and various other systems. So we need to make sure that the glucose level does stay at a normal and doesn't go too high or too low. So if it goes too high, we take glucose out of our blood into the cells, and we also will convert glucose, which is the main molecule here that we're focusing on, into something called glycogen. And glycogen is the equivalent of a storage in our bodies to what plants use, which is starch, which you've come across before. So starch is used in plants, but in animals, in humans, we use glycogen. So we store glucose as glycogen, which is really handy. But both of these jobs, both of these functions, these things that insulin will cause to happen, will bring down the glucose level in the blood back to normal. Simple as that. In higher tier, it's just the opposite really. The pancreas will produce and secrete a hormone instead called glucagon. And glucagon will cause glucose to be moved from cells into the blood, and it will cause the liver and the muscle cells to convert glycogen back to glucose. So glucagon is released when glucose is gone, and it causes glucose to come back in higher concentrations by moving the glucose from the cells back into the blood and breaking glycogen down back into glucose. And that again will bring the level of glucose in your blood back up to what is normal. So it's all about reversing the change. So the key terms we've got here, insulin and glucagon. We've also got glucose and glycogen. And although in your exam you won't be assessed on your spelling typically, because you've got three keywords here which are very similar, glucose, glycogen and glucagon, you must make sure that you practice the spelling of these and using them in the correct context. Because if you get them mixed up, if you spell glycogen, you won't be given credit. You might get away with it in other questions when there aren't kind of areas that you could mix up. But in this, you must get it absolutely spot on. Now, as much as we need to know how this works in a normal, healthy body, the pancreas and the insulin mechanism can also go slightly wrong, or quite disastrously wrong. And this is the disease called diabetes. And you're probably aware that there are two types of diabetes. There's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 typically develops earlier in a patient's life. It's the one that you don't have much control over whether you get it or not. There are various links, genetic and just random chance sometimes. But there's not much really in the way of lifestyle that will impact whether you get type 1 diabetes or not. Type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, has various lifestyle risk factors like obesity. But let's talk about what they are. So in type 1 diabetes, what happens is the pancreas is failing to produce insulin in sufficient quantities or at all really, and that is basically where the pancreas is not functioning properly as it should. So this whole part of the negative feedback loop just does not function. So if your glucose level goes too high, your body's not able to bring it back down. So if you have type 1 diabetes and you eat really sugary food, your body is really going to suffer. So patients have typically high glucose levels, and it obviously can be easily diagnosed by doing a blood test. The way that it's treated is simple. Because they don't have the insulin being produced, we can treat it with insulin injections and obviously a regulated diet to make sure that the glucose levels aren't going to fluctuate too much. So that's a horrible disease to live with, but it can be fairly well managed if carefully monitored and treated with injections. In type 2 diabetes, what's happening instead is that the body is producing insulin, but for whatever reason, the body is no longer responding to that insulin. So the insulin is being released in high quantities because of a high sugar content of your blood, glucose content in your blood, but the cells aren't removing the glucose from the blood, and the liver isn't storing so much glucose into glycogen. It's almost like the insulin is being ignored at this point. It's been around so much that it's just like, oh yeah, well, nothing's really changed here. Why do we need to deal with the glucose anymore? So the insulin is being produced, but the body's not responding to it. And this is dangerous. It's really dangerous. So obesity is a risk factor. Yes, that's the one that we need to know about. There are various other things like smoking and alcohol, and basically not exercising. All the horrible lifestyle factors that we know are there will increase your risk of getting type 2 diabetes significantly. But it typically develops later in life because these have to have like a additive effect. You need to be exposed to these lifestyle factors for a long time. But increasingly we're seeing it in younger patients. But this can be easily treated as well, possibly even more easily treated. All you need to do is, if you recognize that type 2 diabetes is developing, we need to have a controlled carbohydrate controlled diet, so try not to eat too much in the way of sugar, and exercising. And by doing this, your body is going to be able to better manage the glucose levels and therefore release less insulin and therefore recover. And there's a good chance that actually, if you realise you're getting type 2 diabetes, that it can be reversed completely and you won't actually develop type 2 diabetes anymore. But if it goes too far, you get serious vascular problems, and it can be really difficult to live with. But that's our overview of the endocrine system and blood glucose concentration today. Hopefully it's been useful. If you've got any questions or queries or comments, do write them down below, and do like and subscribe and hit the bell for more videos that are going to be coming out soon. And check out the rest of the homeostasis topic that we have covered.